Me, Lillian Director of Strategic Operations, a title they gave me. In reality, I was more like a corporate shaman, a healer. I was brought into this big tech company to fix its most profitable, yet most problematic department. The mission was simple: detoxify the culture. My predecessor was some old-school guy who retired, left behind a department that ran like a well-oiled machine, but a machine without a soul. The first day I walked in, I could feel it. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and silent, repressed testosterone. No collaboration, no vibrant energy. Just the quiet hum of servers and the frantic clicking of keyboards. Men in gray and blue shirts hunched over their desks, barely looking up. It was a cultural wasteland. My office overlooked the main floor. I spent the first few days just observing, taking notes, diagnosing the sickness. 2 sources of the infection became clear almost immediately. The first was a project manager named Sergio. He wasn't overtly hostile. Worse, he was one of those numbers guys. Everything was about metrics, KPIs, data points, deadlines. He'd walk up to people's desks and talk in this clipped, urgent tone about deliverables and client expectations. He had this look of perpetual, low-grade panic in his eyes, as if the world would end if a report was an hour late. He never asked how anyone was feeling. He never tried to build a personal connection. It was all just work, 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 a human spreadsheet. He was the engine of the department's anxiety, pushing everyone toward burnout in the name of efficiency. I saw him as a relic of a bygone era of management, the kind that saw people as resources, not human beings. The second, and far more potent source of toxicity, was an engineer, Cliff. Cliff was the department's ghost. He was their top performer, their miracle worker, the guy they went to when something was truly, irrevocably broken, and he barely ever spoke. He'd sit in his corner, headphones on, staring at multiple screens of code with an intensity that I found deeply unsettling. His silence wasn't peaceful, it was loud. It was an aggressive, defiant silence. It was a wall he built around himself to keep everyone out. He never participated in the light office banter I was trying to encourage. He'd get his coffee, nod curtly if someone spoke to him, and retreat back to his cave. When you asked him a question, he'd look at you, process the query with no emotional feedback, give you the most direct, unvarnished answer possible, and then turn back to his screen. No, how are you? No, have a nice day. Just pure, cold data. This, I knew, was the heart of the problem. This was the pinnacle of toxic masculinity. The strong, silent type who refuses to be emotionally vulnerable, making everyone else around him walk on eggshells. His competence was a weapon he used to enforce his emotional distance. My first big move was to introduce the weekly wellness check-in. I booked the main conference room for an hour every Monday morning, mandatory for everyone. I brought in comfortable cushions to put on the sterile corporate chairs. I wanted to replace their focus on cold, hard deadlines with a focus on warm, soft feelings. The first session was a disaster. I started by asking everyone to go around and share one thing they were grateful for, and one thing that was causing them anxiety that week. The blank stares I received were chilling. A few of the younger guys mumbled something about being grateful for the weekend. Then it was Sergio's turn. He cleared his throat, looked at his watch, and said he was grateful for the team's hard work. But his anxiety was centered on the upcoming deadline for the big client project. He said we were already behind schedule, and this meeting was taking up critical time. He framed it as sharing, but I knew what it was, a direct challenge to my authority. He was weaponizing the safe space I had created to push his own anxiety-fueled agenda. I smiled patiently and told him that deadlines are constructs, but our feelings are real, and we need to honor them first. He just blinked, looking confused. Then it was Cliff's turn. He looked up from the floor for the first time in 20 minutes. I asked him what he was feeling. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I feel like this meeting is preventing me from fixing the server issue that's been causing latency since Friday." A few people shuffled their feet. Someone coughed. The air crackled with tension. This was open rebellion. It was a calculated, passive-aggressive jab designed to undermine the very foundation of the new culture I was trying to build. I ended the meeting early, telling everyone to reflect on what was shared. I went back to my office and wrote down both of their names. Cliff, I circled 3 times. The silent ones are always the most dangerous. I decided to start with him. You have to remove the alpha to change the pack's dynamic. I began documenting his behavior. Every time he sent a short one-line email without a friendly opening or closing, I saved it to a folder labeled Hostile Communication. Every time he declined a meeting invitation for a synergy workshop because of a critical task, I screenshotted it, folder, Refusal to Collaborate. Every time I saw him walk past a group of people without joining the conversation, I made a note, folder, Fostering an Exclusionary Environment. Within a few weeks, I had a substantial file. It was a clear pattern of antisocial, non-collaborative behavior. He wasn't a team player, he was a lone wolf, and lone wolves don't belong in a modern, inclusive workplace. I scheduled a one-on-one with him in my office. I wanted to give him one last chance to integrate. I started the meeting by asking him, on a scale of 1 to 10, how connected he felt to the team's emotional journey. He just stared at me. He looked like a computer that had been given a command it couldn't process. He finally said his job was to ensure the technical infrastructure was stable and efficient, and that he felt very connected to that task. I tried a different approach. I told him his communication style could be perceived as intimidating and cold by some of his colleagues. He considered this for a moment. Then he asked me if anyone had ever complained that his solutions to their technical problems were ineffective or late. I had to admit they hadn't. His performance reviews, filled with numbers and stats from my predecessor, were glowing. He said, "Then it seems my communication is perfectly effective for my role." He was twisting my words, using logic to evade emotional accountability. The conversation was going nowhere. He was a fortress. I needed to bring in bigger guns. I set up a meeting with HR. I brought my folder of evidence. I laid it all out for the HR manager. I used all the right language. I spoke of microaggressions, of passive hostility, of the chilling effect his behavior had on psychological safety. I explained that while his technical output was high, his cultural deficit was a net negative for the company's future. The HR manager, a woman who seemed a bit overwhelmed, flipped through my printed out emails and notes. She said his file was clean, nothing but praise for his work. I told her that was the problem. The old culture only rewarded one kind of labor, the technical kind. It completely ignored the vital and mostly female-led emotional labor that truly holds a team together. She looked at a one-line email from Cliff that said, "The fix is deployed." I explained how that message, devoid of any emotional padding, was a microaggression. It implied that the recipient's feelings about the problem didn't matter, only the solution. I could see the light bulb go on in her head. She was starting to get it. They called Cliff in. It was me, him, and the HR manager in a small, sterile room. She presented my concerns in a softened, corporate-friendly way. She talked about perceptions and communication styles. Cliff listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he asked a single question. He asked her to provide a specific example of a time when his behavior caused a project to fail, a deadline to be missed, or a client to complain. The HR manager looked at me. I jumped in. I told him this wasn't about deadlines or clients. This was about people. It was about the health of the team. He was being deliberately obtuse, focusing on tangible outcomes to avoid the real issue of intangible feelings. He looked from me to the HR manager and said nothing. He just let the silence sit there. It was his ultimate power move, an assertion of dominance. After he left the room, I told the HR manager, "You see, he refuses to engage. He's not accountable. He's not one of us." The decision was made a few days later. They were letting him go. The official reason was vague. Restructuring to better align with our collaborative forward-facing strategy. Corporate nonsense. We both knew the real reason. He didn't fit my vision. The day he was let go was quiet. They had security escort him, which I thought was overly dramatic but standard procedure. He didn't make a scene. He packed his small box of personal items, a couple of books, a worn-out coffee mug, a small figurine from some nerdy show. As he walked out, a few of the other male engineers quietly got up and shook his hand. They didn't say much, just a "take care, man," or a "good luck." Sergio was one of them. He clapped Cliff on the shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. It was like watching a silent funeral procession, a final defiant display of their toxic, exclusionary male bonding. I felt a surge of relief as the door closed behind him. The first tumor had been excised. the healing could truly begin. I already had his replacement lined up. Her name was Susan. I'd met her at a Women in Leadership networking brunch a while back. She didn't have a traditional tech background, but that's what I loved about her. She was a fresh perspective. Her resume was full of things like workshop facilitator, community outreach coordinator, and synergistic process innovator. In her interview, she spoke my language. She talked about empowerment, about creating dialogue, about the importance of vulnerability in the workplace. She didn't mention code or servers once. It was perfect. She was exactly the kind of energy the department needed. Susan's first day was a breath of fresh air. She brought in a small plant for her desk. She went around and introduced herself to everyone, asking them not what they did, but how they were feeling about their work. Most of the men just gave her confused looks and mumbled something about being fine. But I knew she was planting seeds. We immediately clicked. We'd have long lunches where we'd deconstruct the lingering toxic masculinity in the team. She pointed out things I hadn't even noticed, like how the men would use acronyms without explaining them, a subtle way of excluding those not in the know, or how they'd put on headphones to signal "do not disturb," effectively refusing to be open and available to their colleagues. She was brilliant. She saw it all. With Susan on my side, I felt empowered to escalate my reforms. We turned the Monday Wellness Check-In into a feeling forum. We introduced Woke Wednesdays, where we'd watch a TED Talk about diversity and inclusion and then share our thoughts. We created a kudos board where people were encouraged to give shout-outs not for work accomplished, but for emotional support provided. The board was mostly filled with Susan and me, writing notes to each other. But it was a start. There was still resistance, of course, a quiet, stubborn resistance. It was centered around Sergio. He was the last bastion of the old guard. Now that Cliff was gone, the technical problems started piling up. Little things at first. A system glitch here, a slow network there. Previously, these things would just disappear. Cliff would handle them before anyone even knew they were a major issue. Now, they festered. Susan, bless her heart, tried her best. Her solution to a server crash was to suggest we all gather in a circle and visualize the server healing itself with positive energy. When that didn't work, she organized a workshop to discuss how the server crash made us feel. The other engineers were getting visibly stressed, and their stress was funneled directly to Sergio, who became even more obsessed with his charts and timelines. He started sending me daily emails with subject lines in all caps: urgent, critical. He tried to schedule meetings to discuss project viability. I saw it for what it was. He was trying to reimpose the old fear-based hierarchy. He was using the department's struggles as a pretext to dismantle my new, people-centric culture. He was Cliff's legacy, a ghost haunting the machine. And I knew he had to go too. The detox wasn't complete. I still had one more demon to exorcise. Be me, still Lillian. The department was lighter after Cliff's departure, but it wasn't clean. Sergio was a constant throbbing source of negative energy. His entire existence seemed dedicated to reminding me of reality, as he called it. He would stand in the doorway of my office, holding his tablet like a shield, ready to bombard me with charts that trended downwards and spreadsheets filled with red cells. He just didn't get it. He thought the problems were technical. I knew they were spiritual. The team's heart was wounded from years of neglect under the old regime, and he just wanted to put a bandage on a bullet wound and tell it to get back to work. My new approach was to manage his negativity. When he sent me an email with an urgent subject line, I created a rule to automatically file it into a folder named Opportunities for Growth. I'd get to it when I had the emotional bandwidth. When he tried to corner me by the coffee machine to talk about blockers and slipping timelines, I'd smile, put a hand on his arm, and ask him how he was really doing. I'd ask if he was getting enough sleep, if he felt supported. It would completely derail him. He'd stammer, look confused, and retreat back to his desk. It was a technique I learned: meet aggressive energy with soft, compassionate energy. It neutralizes the threat. The breaking point came during a mid-quarter review meeting. I had invited a director from another department to observe our new collaborative processes. I wanted to show her what a healthy team looked like. Susan opened the meeting with a 5-minute guided meditation on releasing attachment to outcomes. It was beautiful. The energy in the room felt so calm. And then Sergio asked to share his screen. Before I could stop him, a horrifying graph filled the monitor. It was a burned-down chart, a sea of angry red, showing our project progress plummeting into the ground. He started talking, his voice tight with stress. He pointed out the missed milestones, the rising number of critical bugs, the complete lack of progress on the new features for our biggest client. He said in front of our guest, "At this rate, we will not only miss the final deadline, we will deliver a completely non-functional product." The guest director looked at me, her eyebrows raised. The room was dead silent. He had ambushed me. He had used my own transparent forum to publicly humiliate me and my methods. He had tried to drag us all back into his pit of fear and negativity. I took a deep, calming breath. I would not let him control the narrative. I smiled warmly. I told everyone, "Thank you, Sergio, for sharing that data. It's so brave of you to be that vulnerable with your anxieties." I turned to the guest. "What you're seeing," I explained, "is the final purge of the old deadline-driven toxicity. We are intentionally deconstructing the harmful myth of linear progress. We are prioritizing process over product, people over profit." Susan nodded enthusiastically, adding, "We are in our chrysalis phase. The butterfly will be magnificent." Sergio just stared at the screen, his face pale. He opened his mouth to say something else. I cut him off. I said, "Sergio, I think you've contributed enough for today. In fact, I think you've contributed enough for good." I told him that his energy was no longer aligned with the forward-moving trajectory of the team. I fired him, right there, in the middle of the meeting. I needed to make an example of him. I needed everyone to see that the old ways were dead and buried. He didn't protest. He just slowly packed his laptop into his bag, stood up, and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. The guest director looked like she had just witnessed a ritual sacrifice. I turned to the rest of the team and smiled brightly. "Now," I said, "who wants to talk about how that made them feel?" With Sergio gone, the last pillar of the old patriarchy had crumbled. I was free to build my utopia. I promoted Susan to a newly created role, Director of Team Harmony. And to replace Sergio, I brought in someone truly special, Mildred. Mildred was Susan's friend, and she was a revelation. Her background wasn't in project management. It was in conflict resolution and restorative justice. She was a certified practitioner of nonviolent communication. In her interview, she told me she didn't believe in deadlines. She called them tools of corporate oppression designed to induce anxiety. She believed in organic timelines that honor the natural ebb and flow of creative energy. I hired her on the spot. The change was immediate and profound. The office was finally a sanctuary. We replaced the harsh fluorescent overheads with warm-toned lamps. We had a dedicated quiet room with beanbag chairs for when people felt overwhelmed. We started every day with a 15-minute session of mindful breathing. Mildred was incredible. She resolved every issue with therapy speak. When two engineers disagreed on a technical approach, she'd sit them down and have them use "I feel" statements. The discussion would end not with a decision, but with both of them feeling heard and validated. The actual technical problem, of course, remained unsolved, but the interpersonal conflict was gone, and that was the real victory. Our meetings were no longer about work, they were about us. We had workshops on building trust. We created emotional weather reports, where everyone had to describe their inner state using a meteorological metaphor. Today, I'm feeling partly cloudy with a chance of existential dread. It was a place of total psychological safety. No one was ever wrong. No idea was ever bad. All feelings were valid. The few remaining male engineers were very quiet. They just sat at their desks with their headphones on, trying to keep the systems from literally catching on fire. I saw their silence not as resistance anymore, but as a sign of quiet contemplation. They were finally learning to listen. I had done it. I had built a team based on pure empathy, a true corporate sisterhood. We were unstoppable. The first call from the client came a few weeks later. It was a polite check-in, a junior account manager asking for a status update on the project. Mildred took the call. She spent 20 minutes explaining to him that we had shifted our focus from product-centric outcomes to people-centric processes. She told him we were building a sustainable foundation of collaborative trust that would ultimately lead to a more authentic product. The account manager was silent for a moment, then asked again, "Right, but is the beta version going to be ready by the 15th?" Mildred gently corrected him, explaining that readiness is a journey, not a destination. After the call, she told me the client seemed a bit rigid and fixated on outdated paradigms. We all agreed he needed to be more open-minded. The calls started getting more frequent. They were from a more senior manager now. His voice had an edge to it. He didn't seem interested in our journey. He was very focused on the destination. He started talking about contractual obligations and breach of terms. Such aggressive masculine language. Susan handled one of these calls. She tried to explain to him that his demanding energy was creating a cycle of anxiety that was counterproductive to the creative process. He was not receptive. I realized we were dealing with a client who was deeply enmeshed in a toxic corporate culture. They just didn't understand what we were trying to achieve. It wasn't our fault. It was theirs. They weren't ready for us. Things started to get a little chaotic. The automated error reports from our systems were flooding our inboxes. Previously, Cliff would have just handled these. Now, they piled up, unread. One of the quiet engineers came to me, looking pale. He told me a core database was corrupting data, and if we didn't fix it immediately, the entire platform would become unusable for the client. I looked at his tired, stressed face. Poor thing. He was so caught up in the fear. I sent him to the quiet room with Mildred for a session on letting go of catastrophic thinking. She had him do some deep breathing and visualize the database healing itself. He came out looking even more pale. The client emails were now arriving with angry red subject lines. They were sending screenshots of the product not working, error messages, crashed pages, complete failures. I looked at them and felt a sense of pity. Pity for the client, who couldn't see the beautiful collaborative process happening behind the scenes. They were only looking at the ugly, imperfect surface. They were judging our butterfly, while it was still a messy goo in the chrysalis. It was their loss, really. One afternoon, Susan, Mildred, and I were in the conference room, working on a vision board for the department's 5-year emotional growth plan. We were cutting out pictures from magazines that represented synergy and empowerment. My phone rang. It was from the vice president's office, his executive assistant. Her voice was cold. She said the VP wanted to see me in his office, immediately. She said, "And he wants you to bring the client project status report." I told her we didn't really do status reports anymore. We found them to be an overly simplistic and reductive tool. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Just get in here, Lillian." As I walked to the elevator, I felt a surge of excitement. This was it. The moment the old guard finally had to confront the new paradigm. The VP, a man who only ever spoke in terms of profit and loss, was finally going to get a real education in what truly matters. I was ready to enlighten him. Be me, Lillian, striding towards my destiny. The walk to the executive floor felt like a victory lap I was taking in advance. The carpets were thicker up here, the air quieter. The art on the walls was abstract and expensive. This was the nerve center of the old guard, the heart of the machine I was here to change. The VP's name was Mr. Henderson, or something equally bland and forgettable. I just thought of him as the numbers. I rehearsed my opening statement in my head. I wouldn't be defensive, I would be educational. I was going to explain to him that true ROI isn't measured in dollars, but in a thriving, self-actualized workforce. I was going to teach him a lesson in 21st century leadership. I felt calm, centered, powerful. I was on the right side of history. His assistant showed me in. The office was huge, with a massive window overlooking the city. The numbers was sitting behind a desk the size of a small car. He wasn't smiling. He didn't say hello. He just gestured to the chair opposite him. "Lillian," he said, his voice flat. "Tell me about the client project." Here we go. Showtime. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on his desk. I began my speech. I told him about the paradigm shift, about moving from a model of extraction to a model of cultivation. I talked about synergy, psychological safety, and the deconstruction of traditional power hierarchies. I explained that the so-called delays and bugs were not failures, but growth opportunities. They were the growing pains of a team unlearning years of toxic conditioning. I spoke for a solid 5 minutes, my voice filled with passion and conviction. He listened without interrupting. His expression never changed. It was like talking to a statue. When I finished, there was a long silence. He swiveled his large monitor around to face me. The screen was split in two. On the left was a graph labeled Department Output, 6 months prior to your arrival. It was a beautiful, steady, upward climbing line. On the right was a graph labeled Department Output, last 6 months. The line fell off a cliff. It wasn't a slope, it was a plunge. It hit the bottom of the graph and just flatlined. I stared at it. It was so aggressive, so simplistic. That chart, I said, my voice still patient, is a perfect example of the kind of narrow, soulless metric we are trying to transcend. He ignored me. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a letter, on the client's official letterhead. I picked it up. It was from their CEO. The letter was short, brutal, and to the point. It detailed a catastrophic failure of project management, a complete breakdown in professional communication, and a level of incompetence that is frankly baffling. It formally announced they were terminating their multi-million-dollar contract, effective immediately. It ended with a line about seeking legal counsel to recoup damages. I put the letter down. My hands felt cold. This was a setback, I admitted. The client was clearly not as evolved as we were. This is what happens, I began, rallying myself, when you try to introduce a new way of thinking to a system that is fundamentally resistant to change. This isn't our failure, it's theirs. They weren't ready to be our partners on this journey. The numbers finally showed a flicker of emotion. It was a look of profound, exhausted disbelief. A journey? He repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Lillian, this isn't a journey. This is a business. We sell a service. We have contracts. We have obligations. They paid us for a functioning product, not a spiritual awakening. I opened my mouth to explain that the two were intertwined. He held up a hand. I've heard enough of your explanations, he said. Your team has produced nothing of value for 6 months. You have alienated our single largest client. You have turned the most profitable department in this company into a black hole. He stood up. Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items. I was stunned. I felt the air leave my lungs. Terminated? Me? It didn't make any sense. I had done everything right. I had followed the teachings of every leadership guru, every progressive management book. I had created a paradise of empathy and collaboration. You can't do this, I whispered. I can, he said, turning to look out his window. I just did. Pack your things. I walked out of his office in a daze. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Security guards, 2 big guys who always looked bored, were waiting for me by the elevator. They followed me back to my department, my beautiful safe space. As I walked in, everyone looked up. The quiet engineers quickly looked back down at their screens. But I only had eyes for Susan and Mildred, my sisters, my allies. They would be outraged. They would protest. Maybe they would even quit in solidarity. I walked towards them, my eyes pleading for support. He fired me, I said, my voice trembling. He doesn't understand. They're kicking me out. Susan looked up from her computer. Her face was a mask of professional concern. She wasn't typing code. I saw her screen for a split second. It was LinkedIn. She was updating her skills section. Oh, Lillian, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. That is such challenging feedback to receive. I'm holding space for you in this difficult moment. She wasn't getting up. She wasn't angry. She was just observing. I turned to Mildred. Surely Mildred, the empath, would understand. Mildred gave me a small, tight smile. Lillian, she said, speaking slowly as if to a child. We honor your path and your truth, but it seems your narrative is no longer in alignment with the company's fiscal story. We wish you well as you transition to your next chapter. Transition to my next chapter? Narrative? They were using my own words to cut me loose. They weren't my allies. They were just passengers. And the train had crashed, so they were calmly getting off and looking for the next one. The security guard coughed politely. Ma'am, your personal items? I looked around my office. The plants, the inspirational posters, the vision board Susan and I had made. It all looked cheap and pathetic. I didn't take anything. I just turned and walked out. I didn't look back. A few months passed. Life got very real, very fast. The generous severance package ran out. My network of women in leadership friends suddenly went quiet. My calls went to voicemail. My emails went unanswered. I ended up getting a job at a high-end coffee shop. A barista. The irony was not lost on me, but not in the way you'd think. I saw it as proof. I was a creator of wonderful, nuanced experiences, but the world was full of crude people who just wanted a product. They didn't care about the ethically sourced beans or the barista's emotional state. They just wanted their caffeine, fast and cheap, just like the numbers, just like the client. I would spend my days frothing milk and telling myself I was a misunderstood genius, a prophet without honor in my own land. One afternoon, I was wiping down a table during a quiet spell. Someone had left behind a business magazine, one of those glossy ones with pictures of smiling CEOs on the cover. I picked it up to throw it away, but then I froze. I recognized the faces on the cover. It was Cliff and Sergio. They were standing side by side, arms crossed, looking confident and relaxed. They were actually smiling. Above them, the headline blared in huge letters. The Fixers, How a Startup Built from Corporate Ashes Landed. A $50 million contract in 6 months. My heart started pounding. I opened the magazine, my hands shaking. The article told the whole story. How 2 veteran tech experts had left their old company due to creative differences with new management. How they had immediately started their own consulting firm. How their first call was to a major client who had recently been abandoned by their previous provider. My client, our client. The article quoted the client's CEO. Cliff and Sergio came in, didn't make excuses, and fixed a year's worth of problems in 2 weeks. They deliver results, not jargon. Hiring them was the best decision we ever made. The article concluded by saying their startup had just been valued at a staggering amount, and they were hiring aggressively. I stared at the picture, at Cliff's calm, competent face, at Sergio's focused, determined expression. All the pieces were there. The story was laid out in black and white, the cause and the effect. But my mind couldn't put them together. It just wouldn't connect. It was like looking at a math problem where the answer was demonstrably wrong, impossible. It couldn't be them. It couldn't be their way. I had created a supportive, nurturing, empathetic environment. They had created, well, whatever toxic, male-dominated, emotionally stunted thing they did. And they had won. I dropped the magazine on the floor. I looked out the window at the busy street, at the world that had so thoroughly rejected my vision, and only one thought echoed in the stunned silence of my mind. It just goes to show you. The patriarchy always wins.